There we go. Hide that. Hopefully that's coming through. Excellent. Cool. Well, let me just start off by saying it's a great honor to be doing the keynote of today's event. I just want to say a huge thank you to the organizers. I always have great reverence for people who organize conferences like this, so that speakers like myself, my other co-speakers, get the opportunity to share our knowledge. So a big thank you to them for all of their efforts. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about Blazor in .NET 5, and specifically, I'm going to be talking to you about some of my picks for some of the great new features that are coming to Blazor in .NET 5. Now, I've got a lot to pack in, so this will go at a fairly fast pace. But what I'm going to do is to start off with, I'm going to give a quick overview of what .NET 5 is, because it is a bit different from other versions or previous versions of .NET. And then we're going to go into the Blazor specific stuff, and I'm going to show you some code examples of some of these features working in Visual Studio. So first things first, overview of .NET 5. So what is .NET 5? Why is it different? Well, basically, .NET 5 is a unification of the .NET platform. Over recent years, the .NET platform has become what feels quite fractured. There's .NET Framework, there's .NET Core, there's .NET Standard, there's Xamarin, there's Unity. There's all these different things. And if you're coming into the .NET universe as a new developer, it's probably quite intimidating. It's hard to know where you need to start learning and what does what. And the goal of .NET 5 is to create one platform that new developers can get behind and and to simplify things for existing developers. So the goal really is one base class library, one SDK, a unified tool chain. So when you're creating new applications with .NET 5, you will just create a .NET 5 application, and it will be able to create all of these things that are shown on the slide that I've very stealthily stolen from the .NET team's blog, but I did credit them down the bottom, so it's okay. The other great thing about .NET 5 is it brings with it a new release schedule for .NET. So up till now, releases for .NET have been a bit unpredictable. Whereas with .NET 5, we will get the GA of .NET 5 in November of this year, so not long now, just less than a month, really. And then we will get a new version of .NET every year in November. So .NET 6 will come in 2021, .NET 7 in November 2022. The other good thing about this is every even-numbered version of .NET going forward will be a long-term service version. So this simplifies things as well for anybody who's looking to release only on long-term service releases and stuff like that. Makes everything much easier to understand, much more predictable going forward. So that's a quick bit about what .NET 5 is. So let's now start talking about what's new with Blazor. So there's a lot of new features in .NET 5 for Blazor, and that's really impressive considering the team had quite a compressed schedule for doing this. The team have been working on Blazor WebAssembly up until May of this year to get that to a production-ready version. So they've actually only been working on new features for .NET 5 from May onwards. So I've listed here around 15 features that are in .NET 5 for Blazor. So that's quite impressive considering that timescale. And also this doesn't include lots of bug fixes and little minor tweaks here and there. So there was a lot of stuff that was included in .NET 5 for Blazor. But the bits I'm highlighted here, CSS isolation, JavaScript isolation, virtualization, a couple of new form components in input file and input radio. We've got the ability now to use custom validation classes. We can use iasync disposable. There's now support for the toggle event. We've got offset X and Y on mouse event Rs because that was missing before. There's optional and catch-all root parameters. There's some really good runtime perf improvements in Blazor WebAssembly. We've got lazy loading in Blazor WebAssembly. We've got server-side rendering in Blazor WebAssembly. We've got the ability now to focus UI elements built into the framework rather than having to write our own custom JavaScript interop. And there'll also be a new protected browser storage package, which will encrypt your data when it's saving into local storage APIs. So there's a lot of stuff here, but obviously I can't talk to you all about that. I've only got half an hour. So I'm going to highlight the 4 things that really excite me about the new features that are coming. And that is virtualization, CSS isolation, JavaScript isolation, and lazy loading. These are among the highest requested features of Blazor, and I think they're sort of really good additions to the framework. So the first one I'm going to talk about is virtualization. So virtualization, if you've not heard about this before, is a way of making rendering large data sets much more performant. So in the example I'm going to show you, I've got like 10,000 rows that we're going to render, and that usually causes a problem for SPA framework. So this isn't a problem limited to Blazor. This is kind of any SPA framework that needs to track the state of the DOM. So let's get into Visual Studio and have a look at this. So what I've got here is a .NET 5 Blazor app. So I'm using the preview version of Visual Studio, and this is built with the .NET 5 RC2 preview, RC2 release, sorry. I've got a Blazor WebAssembly app, and it's using the ASP.NET Core hosted template. So I've got a server backend. And all I've got in this server project is this to-do controller that's going to create 10,000 random to-dos so that we can have a look at this virtualization. So if I go over to my web browser, which one? This one, and I go to this virtualization page, take note what's going to happen now. When I click this, we get a long loading period. And bear in mind, I'm running this all locally, and my machine is not slow at all. So the fact that took a second or two to load, it kind of tells you what's going on. But more importantly, if I start clicking these and I move my mouse, you can see how long the lag is between clicking something and the UI refreshing. And that's because Blazor's got to keep track of all 10,000 elements that are currently rendered on the screen. So this is where virtualization can improve things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the Blazor app, open up my virtualization page here. And this is what's currently going on. I'm loading those to-dos from my API in onInitialized async, and then I'm rendering them out into this unordered list using a for each statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this code with some other code. So let me just pop this in here. What I've done here is I've added a div, and then inside of that div, we still got a UL like we had before, but now we have the virtualized component inside of that. And what I'm doing now is I'm passing my list of jobs to be displayed via this items parameter. And then what I'm doing is inside of here, I'm declaring a template for what I want displayed. So I'm going to, each element in this items list is going to be rendered as an LI element. And then I'm just going to have all of the stuff I had before. Okay. Now, what's important about virtualization is it works by knowing the height, the viewport, and only rendering the elements that are currently visible, and maybe one or two either side to make scrolling smoother. So in order to do that, we have to specify some sizes. So what I've done on the virtualized component is I've said every item in my list is going to have a height of 34 pixels. Now I want 10 items to show. So I times that by 10, and then my container div, I've set a height of 340, which I hope my maths is correct on that. So all I've done is put that in place. So I go back to my app now and hit refresh. Blazor's going to do a build in the background, and after a second or two, then it's going to refresh the site for us. And hopefully we'll see a much quicker load time. So there we go. We had a flash of the loading, but then our list appeared quite quickly. And you can see if I scroll, everything's nice and smooth. I can get all my lists just as I did before. You can see my slider moving down at the side there. But the big difference this time is if I hit this tick box now, everything is instant. Okay, much more responsive UI. And that's because Blazor's only having to track the elements that are currently in view. And if I open up the browser tools, and if I select one of these elements here and I scroll up a bit, if you watch me scrolling, you can see Blazor is adding elements at the top here and removing them at the bottom. And that's what it's doing with that virtualized component. It knows the height, and it's only rendering the ones that are physically in view for us as the user, which makes things a lot more performant. So cool. So that's rendering with one big list, but you might not want to do this, okay? You might not want to load 10,000 items right at the start of things. So what you can do as well with the virtualized component is you can create a method that you can pass to the virtualized component, and it will call this method to load your data in chunks rather than one big hit. So that's what this load job method is doing right here. This is the signature you need in order to conform to the delegate that's required for the virtualized component. And what I'm doing in here is I'm just taking the total number of jobs. I know there's 10,000 here. I'm working out the number of jobs that I want to show, and then I'm making a call to an API endpoint. I've got the start index and then the number of jobs that I want to retrieve. And then that's going to be returned back to the virtualized component as a new items provider result. So what I need to do here in order to make this work is I replace my items list with items provider, and then I'm going to add in my load jobs method like this. So if I hit save with that, and I go back over to my browser now, again, that'll do a rebuild in the background. Now, everything should work as it did before. We shouldn't see any changes here. So if I scroll this list, you can still see everything is loading as it was before. But if I go to the browser tools and go to the network tab, you can see that actually it's making requests every time I'm scrolling. And you can see here, it's got the start index, which is 45, and then the number of items to retrieve, which is 15. So as I said, I want 10 rendered, and it's just rendering a couple either side so that that scrolling is nice and smooth. Cool. So that is a quick whiz round virtualization. The next thing that I want to talk to you about is CSS isolation. Now, this is probably one of the most requested features for Blazor since very, very early on. So a lot of people, I think, will be very happy to see CSS isolation. So I'm going to go back over to Visual Studio now. I'm going to add a global style. Okay, I'm going to pop in a style here, and I'm going to pop in this H3 style. So what I've done now is I've said every H3 tag in my app, which is basically every page heading, should be green and bold. So I'm just doing a quick build here, and then I'm going to come back over and refresh the screen. And now I've got green headers on all of my pages, okay? So that's kind of traditionally how we would style our apps. We would create these global styles. But the problem is now, what happens if I want to style my counter header differently? What if I want that to be purple, for example? Well, I can do that. I can go in here and I can say, right, I'll start off with my counter page. I can say, right, my counter has got a class of header, okay? And I'm going to save that. And then in my global styles, I can say dot header, and I can say that the color should be purple, like this. Okay, so I can do that. I can come over here and do a rebuild, and hopefully now we'll see a purple counter. Excellent, we have. So that's fine, but obviously that's a very small example. We start extrapolating this out over an entire large application. Now that's lots and lots of all these little style classes. And more importantly, what happens if I want to use a library and that has a CSS class called header as well, and they conflict? And now I've got to worry about how I order my CSS styles, or I might have to go in and do something like add important to make sure it overrides my my style, makes my style the most important one to render. So that can all be a bit of a pain. So what we can do instead, if I remove that style, is we can use CSS isolation. And what this does is it allows us to specify styles that only apply to that component. So if I go into my pages folder here and I add a new file, okay, so I'm going to add a new file, a new style sheet, in fact. I'm going to use a special syntax. I'm going to use the name of the component .razor.css, and you'll see that Visual Studio nicely nests that folder for me, file for me. So what I've done then is added this H3 style. So this is the same as I've got in my global style to set that color to purple. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to do a build as well there. And then I'm going to do a refresh. And now hopefully everything should stay the same. We should still see a purple counter, which we do, which is great. And if I go to home, that's still green. But if I inspect the HTML now, you can see here that all of the various HTML elements for the counter component have all got this unique identifier applied to them as an attribute, this B hyphen, and then this random string after it. And that's been done by Blazor at compile time. And that's been done to scope the CSS. So if I click on this H3 tag, you can see that my CSS has actually been rewritten. So my H3 style is now H3, and then it's scoped to that unique identifier. And that means that it can't collide with any styles in the rest of my app. It can't collide with any styles in any other components. And what I can do is, or what Blazor is going to do for me as well, is it's going to take all of these individual scope style sheets, and it's going to wrap them all up into a single style sheet that I can include in my index.html. Okay, and that follows the name of the project. So blazorforall.client, which you can see up here, .styles.css. So if I go back to my browser, I've actually got a few of these throughout my app. So if I go to sources, we can see that file, and you can see in here all of the various styles, and Blazor is actually nicely annotated which particular component these styles came from as well. So I can use that as well for my for if I need to do any debugging with any styling, of course. So CSS isolation is a very, very powerful tool, and it's quite simple to demonstrate, but it really does make life working with components in CSS much, much simpler. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is JavaScript isolation. So this is similar to CSS isolation, although it doesn't work in quite the same way. A lot of people kind of expected this to work by creating a file with that naming convention like I showed you, but it's not quite going to work like that. So let me just show you how this all comes together. In order to do this, I'm going to add a new JavaScript file into my application. So I'm going to create a new folder here in my www root. So we'll go new folder. We'll call this JS, and inside of here we're going to add a file, and we're going to add a JavaScript file here. I'm just going to call this alert.js like this. Now what I'm going to do is in here I'm going to add a method, okay, or sorry, add a function called show alert that's going to take a message, and all this is going to do is call the alert API to display the message that I pass in. Now, the key thing here now is I've got this export keyword at the front of the function. And that's because the JavaScript isolation in Blazor is based on ES modules. So this is going to export this function as an ES module. So now I've got that. The key difference here now is I'm not going to put a reference to this JavaScript file anywhere. Okay, I'm just going to leave this in my www root folder and do nothing to include it. No script tags or anything like that. I'm going to come into my counter component, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to inject the IJS runtime service. Okay, so I'm going to inject that service, and then I'm going to add a new field to my component as well. And that field is going to have this new type called JS object reference, and this is new in .NET 5. And what this does is allow us to capture a reference to a JavaScript module. So now we've got that, I'm going to override on initialize for this component. I'm going to use the JS runtime to make a call to this special function called import. And as an argument, I'm going to pass in the file that has the module that I want to import. So what I'm saying now is I want you to import the module that is in the alert.js file. And I'm going to store that as a JS object reference using that field that I just created. So now I've got that module, the reference to that module stored. I can now make a call to it. And I can do that using the similar stuff that I'd use with JS runtime, invoke void and invoke void async. Okay. So I'm going to call invoke void async here. I'm going to say execute my show alert function and pass it the current count of my counter. Now, because this needs to be done asynchronously, I just need to update the method signature here to be a task so I can await that call. So that's gone through now. So if I go back over to my my app and hit refresh, we'll do a rebuild. Now, I want to reiterate yet again, I've not included a script reference to that JavaScript file, okay? It's going to get imported dynamically. So now when I hit click me, we now get this alert pop up and we can see the current count being displayed. And as I click, that current count is going up nicely, okay? So that's really useful. And that's really a very useful tool, especially for library authors like myself. So I've got my Blazor libraries. We do have a few that have JavaScript files that are needed. So now we don't require you to add a JavaScript tag, or at least we won't when .NET 5 is released. We'll be able to dynamically import any JavaScript we need as we need it. So that's really cool. So the last thing I'm going to bring to your attention is lazy loading. So lazy loading is a really cool little feature, and it's, again, very, very highly requested out there in the community. So I'm going to go to this final page, this lazy loading page. And what I've got here is a little demo where I can take some type some markdown on the left, and it's going to get translated into HTML on the right. So if I say, welcome to Blazor for all, and you can see it's being output as a heading over here in my output. Okay. So I'm going to open up the DevTools again. So this is being done because I've included a library in my code called markdig. And inside of that, and that means, let me start that again. And my total application size is also being printed out to the console here. So I've got a total application size at the moment of 9.2 meg. Now, first of all, I want to just highlight that is very large. And that's because I'm running in development mode at the moment. I'm not using any IL linking or anything to cut out unused libraries. So when I publish app, it will be significantly smaller. But for now, let's just remember 9.02 here as the application's file size. Now, if MarkDig itself actually isn't that big a library, but if it was, I might not want to load that unless the user actually went to that particular page, because that way I don't have to load resources they're not actually using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark that particular DLL to be lazy loaded. And to do that, I'm going to open up my CS proj for the project, and I'm going to add a new item group into here. And what I'm doing in this item group is I'm saying to Blazor, this particular DLL, I want it lazy loaded. So don't include it in the initial download of my app. So all I'm going to do is do that. And then I'm going to do a build. And then I'm going to go back to my application. And remember, we've got 9.02 meg here when we built this originally. So let's refresh the app and see what happens this time. So you can see straight away the app size has shrunk. Okay, it's 8.87 now. So not a huge saving, but every little counts. If I go into the network tab, I can find a file in here called blazorboot.json. If I look at its contents, you can see in resources, it's now got MarkDig shown as a lazy assembly. Okay, so it's going to be lazy loaded. So that's great. But actually, if I try to do anything now, I'm going to get an error because, it's going to rely on MarkDig, but MarkDig isn't actually loaded at the moment. So this is all broken. So how do I actually lazy load my assembly? Well, I'm going to go over into my app component, and this is done through the router. So the first thing I'm going to do in here is I'm going to inject a service called Lazy Assembly Loader. And what this does is just allow us to dynamically load assemblies into our Blazor app. Now, I'm going to add a code block down at the bottom here. And inside of that, I'm going to add a method called handle navigate. Now, this is going to get past the navigation context, and I can use the navigation context to know where we're trying to navigate to. So what I'm doing here is I'm checking to see if we're going to navigate to the lazy loading page. If we are, then I'm going to dynamically load that markdig.dll so that it's there for when that page loads up. So that's all that handler's doing. So the only thing I really need to do now is tell the router to call my handler. So I can say on navigate async, call handle navigate like so. If I do that and I go back to my application now and I hit, I'll start on this virtualization page actually and hit refresh just so we can see this as we move over. Cool. If I open the network tab now, if I go to lazy loading, you can now see that markdig.dll was loaded initially. And if I go back over here, my markdown is all working as it was before. So we've dynamically loaded that assembly, which is really cool. Now, if you are dealing with a really big assembly, then you might actually want to show some kind of UI because there might be a slight delay with downloading. So what we can do here is we can add a navigating template to the router. So I'm doing that, saying loading assemblies. And what I'm going to do is just artificially create a delay by putting a task.delay of 2 seconds into here. So now I've done that, I can come back over here, I can hit refresh, and now we'll get that artificial delay and we'll see that load that navigating template show up as we navigate. So you can see here, loading assemblies, and then our page loads up. So even if you have got a really big assembly to load dynamically, then it's not a problem because we can show that sort of nice piece of UI to keep the user entertained while that's happening. So that was the last bit I wanted to show you. That was lazy loading. I appreciate this has been a real whistle stop, but hopefully you found it useful and there's some exciting features for you in .NET 5. I just want to quickly finish up by saying if you do want to get started with Blazor, if you're new to it, then please go to blazor.net. It's got all the information you need to get started. You can use any of these tools to get going and build Blazor applications, which means that means you can build them on any platform, Windows, Mac, or Linux, which is really cool. I also want to say there's some useful resources for you here if you are getting into Blazor, or even if you're in Blazor already and you need some help. There's always some useful stuff to find from one of these links, so hopefully that's useful. And finally, I just want to finish up with a slight personal plug for my book, Blazor in Action. I just want to share with you this 50% off code, which is ML Sainty. And if you go to this bit.ly link, bit.ly/Blazor in action, you can use that code until October 25th to get 50% off. I just want to clarify as well, there is currently some sales going on. And if there's already a sale, this code won't actually do anything. But if there's not, it will give you 50% off the book. So yeah, hopefully that has been of interest to you all. I think I'm basically out of time now, so I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. There's some amazing talks coming from some great speakers, so I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So once again, thank you very much for having me. Hope you've enjoyed everything I've had to say, and have a good day, everybody.
Chicos, si tienen alguna preguntita para Chris, ahorita es el momento. I'm just telling the guy if they have any questions for you.
Cool.
Hey, thanks a lot for your time, Chris. Yeah, I was